This is going to be an in-depth look of how to write a pre-lab in your lab notebook. The first half of the video will give you details of everything that's explained in the rubric. The second half of the video will model what the notebook should look like when you're all finished writing your pre-lab. So let's get started. The first thing that you're going to want to do is you're going to want to label the first 2 pages as table of contents. When you're labeling it as table of contents, you want to make sure that you put the page number in the top right-hand corner. You're going to want to number up to page 50, so that way you don't have to worry about it later on. Then on the first page, you're going to want to write down the experiment name and also the page number, so that way you can list all of the experiments on the left-hand side, and you're going to list all the page numbers in which the lab takes place on the right-hand side. So the first lab that we're going to do is 1 + 2 + 3 = black. That's going to start on page 3. Page 2 of your lab notebook will be table of contents as well. This is just in case we fill up the entire notebook and we have to have 2 pages worth of table of contents. That's pretty standard practice, so you just want to get that in there just to cover yourself for later on. That way you don't have to figure out where to put a new table of contents. Now, page 3 is going to be the start of the lab. What you're going to see on your lab rubric is you're going to see part 1 and part 2. Part 1 is the title of the lab, part 2 is the header. I'm going to show you both of those right now. So the title, of course, of the lab is 1 + 2 + 3 = black. The header will include your name, your lab partners' names, and the starting date of the experiment. Now, when you're writing in your lab notebook, it's crucial to note that you must write in blue or black pen only. No pencil, no red, nothing like that. So what you're seeing in red right now, this is just my notes, so that way you know what section we're talking about in the notebook or on your rubric. Okay? So after you have your header, now you're going to include the purpose of your experiment. In this case, you want to try to shorten it or put it into your own words. It might take you a little while to be able to do that, and that's okay. So if you really don't know how to put it into your own words just yet, feel free to copy it word for word from the pre-lab. But eventually, let's say around lab 3 or 4, you should be able to start putting your purposes in your own words. So in this case, I wrote the purpose of this experiment is to observe several chemical reactions and answer questions. This is going to be part 3 on your rubric, the purpose of the experiment. Now, part 4 has multiple parts. That's the material, equipment, and safety notes. So the materials, that's pretty straightforward. You just want to list the materials that's given to you on your pre-lab sheet. Now, in this particular case, we had to make some adjustments, and that's perfectly okay as well. If you make adjustments, we'll talk about it in class. You'll write it down on your pre-lab sheet, and then you'll write the corrected materials list in your notebook. So notice how I got rid of metric ruler, the materials shown in grid, and I'm only writing down exactly what was given to us in the pre-lab session. Now, after you list your materials, you're going to see on your rubric that you need to do an MSDS. So the MSDS is going to be done for each of the chemicals that are present in the experiment. So in this case, we have 0.1 molar potassium iodide. We have 0.2 molar copper 2 sulfate, 1% solution of sodium hypochlorite, 3% solution of hydrogen peroxide, and we're going to have a starch solution. So these 5 chemicals, you must make an MSDS for them. What is an MSDS? Well, let's take a look at the next page. So an MSDS is a list of safety hazards and first aid measures for each chemical used in the lab. This is going to help keep you safe while you're performing an experiment. So, in order to perform an MSDS, you're going to Google the chemical name plus the term MSDS. And of course, MSDS stands for Material Safety Data Sheet. Most of your safety data sheets can be found on sciencelab.com, usually as a PDF. This is a screenshot of what the website looks like. All right. Now, you're going to focus on the hazards, first aid, and the fire data if it's applicable. We're not always working with things that's flammable. We're not always working with open flames. So most of the time, you won't have to worry about fire data. But if we're working with open flames, and we have a couple of labs in which we will be, you have to make sure that your MSDS includes if a chemical is flammable or not, or how to be safe around a flame working with a certain chemical. So when you're on the MSDS, these are the two sections that you're primarily going to be worried about. Section 3 is the hazards identification, where you're going to look for the potential acute health effects, which essentially means what happens in the short term. So, in this case, with potassium iodide, it says it's slightly hazardous in the case of skin contact, an irritant, of eye contact, also an irritant, of ingestion or inhalation. So, we're not really worried about ingestion because you shouldn't be eating or drinking in the lab. So we're mostly going to focus on skin contact, eye contact, and inhalation. In section 4, you're going to see, sorry about that. In section 4, you're going to see how to handle the first aid for those specific irritants. So we have eye contact, skin contact, and inhalation. For eye contact, it says immediately flush eyes with plenty of water for at least 15 minutes. Skin contact, wash your skin with soap and water in case of contact. And if you breathe it in, you're going to remove the fresh air. So we're going to include that information in our MSDS for potassium iodide. So notice how I have eye irritant. Then immediately afterwards, I have how the first aid should be handled. Skin irritant. Right afterwards, first aid measures. Inhalation hazard. Right afterwards, first aid measures. So this is what a sample MSDS looks like. You're going to want to include that for all of the other chemicals in the lab. So don't just write copper 2 sulfate, hydrogen peroxide, sodium hypochlorite. Make sure you actually do an MSDS for all of these chemicals listed here. After the MSDS, you're going to want to have general safety. This is going to be personal to each person, right? So some common tips would be tie back long hair, wear PPE at all times, no jewelry, so take off your rings, your watches during lab, and of course no food or drink. The ones that I have starred, those are the ones that I'm going to be using because obviously I don't have long hair. So I don't have to worry about tying back long hair, but if you do have long hair, feel free to include that. Last but not least is the procedure. The procedure is usually listed in the pre-lab sheet, but sometimes it changes. So be prepared to make changes, whether it's during the pre-lab or actually during the lab. So give yourself enough room and enough space in your lab notebook to make those changes. So in this case, we made a few changes to the lab, and we're going to write those down in our lab notebooks. So step 1, we're going to get rid of all of step 1 that says copy grid into lab notebook. Then in step 2, we're going to change it to say use the grid as a data table to record your observations. Step 3 is the same. Step 4 says stir each mixture by using a glass stirring rod as directed by your teacher. And I'll teach you how to do that during lab. So we're going to write that into our lab notebooks. I took this 4-step process, turned it into a 3-step process. That's fine, no problem. If you want to bullet it, that's fine. If you want to number it, that's fine. If you want to write it into paragraph form, that's fine as well. I choose to write my procedure as bullet points, but to each his own. As long as the procedure is written clearly, easy to find, I have no problems. Now, there's usually a data table in your lab. With your data table, you want to make sure that you get that in before the lab is done. So that way, or before the pre-lab. So that way you don't have to waste time during the lab, okay? So I just took the grid right from our notebook or right from our lab sheet, put it into our notebook, so that way I can take any observations and write them down in the grid boxes here. If you find that that's not enough room for you, you certainly can write an observation section where you can list all of your notes near your data table. So let's take an example of a lab notebook. Yours is going to look a little bit different because obviously your pages are going to be bigger than mine, but the general gist will be the same. So, of course, you're going to have your table of contents. No huge deal there. Page number, experiment name, everything listed nice and neat. Page 2 will simply have the table of contents and the number 2 on it. More than likely, we won't use this page. So the start of the page, the start of the lab, you're going to have your header here, name, lab names, lab partners' names, first and last name, the date, of course, the title. You're going to have the purpose and the materials listed nice and neat. Notice how I have mine now in 2 columns. You can put it in 2 columns. You can list it all in one column. That's completely up to you. The MSDS, I only did it for potassium iodide. Yours is going to have it for all 5 chemicals. Then general safety. Notice how I'm following the rubric, and I'm putting it in nice order so that way it's easy for me to find when I go to grade. Keep that in mind. You want to make sure everything's nice and neat, easy for me to grade. Okay, procedure, written down, bulleted, nice, neat, easy to follow. Then I have my data table. In this case, I don't have enough room, so I'm not going to write any observations in here. I'm just going to use this as a grid to help me perform the experiment. I'm going to take my notes and observations elsewhere. Okay, so during the lab, you're going to put in the first column sodium hypochlorite in the entire column, hydrogen peroxide in the entire column, copper 2 sulfate in the entire column, potassium iodide in this row, potassium iodide and starch in this row, potassium iodide and paper, and finally potassium iodide and starch. Then you're going to observe any chemical reactions that happens. Last but not least, let's go over some key points to remember. Only write in your notebook using blue or black pen only. Don't include any lecture notes. Don't include any things that we have during the pre-lab. Mostly you're going to use your lab notebook for lab and observations. And also, only write on the right-hand side of the page. Don't write on the back. Only on the right-hand side of the notebook. So, also along with that, do not rip out any pages. So you're going to use composition notebooks only. And if you make a mistake, notice how I just put a single line through it and I kept writing the correct spelling right after that. So don't use whiteout, don't use scribbles, don't use black magic marker to black out your lab notebook. You have to remember, your lab notebook is a legal document, so you're responsible for anything that you write inside of it. You can, however, use highlighters and underlining to clarify the sections in the notebooks. So just make it easy for me to grade. I don't want to have to search through and try to find your procedure, your purpose. Underline it, highlight it, something, so that way I can find it very easily. And most importantly, after you complete your lab, you're going to see on your lab notebook rubric that you have part 6, 7, and 8. Do not skip the analysis and conclusion sections. That's how you lose 25% of your grade. You go from an A, 100 potentially, to at maximum a 75 if you skip part 7 and part 8. It is a big pet peeve of mine. It drives me insane. So please don't do it, okay? If you follow these tips, you follow these instructions, you'll do just fine, and we'll see you in lab.